Popular culture is adrift with mysteries of vampire. It's constantly haunted pop cultures and classic literature like that of Anne Rice that has even made it into popular mainstream with the films of Interview with a Vampire, and of course the new popular TV series that supports the idea. But on this channel, we explore things far beyond just the simple Hollywood gaze, as we have already spoken to several practitioners that identify or practice these specific arts. From Indy Blackwood and the mysteries of the Green Order, to Don Webb and the secrets of the vampire practices of the Scythian tradition. Today, we go a little bit further through the old lands as we explore another one of these practices, the mysteries and the history of the Kheprian Order. Today, my guest, Sean Wilde, who is both an occult teacher, practitioner, and someone who identifies both as a sin eater and as a vampire, unfolds some of these mysteries and the Order's traditions, views, practices, ethics, and sometimes contradictions towards that in the freedom of the practitioner's own understanding, as we explore some of the interesting subject matters from his new book, Living Vampire. So whether you take him at his word as he identifies as a living vampire, or whether you consider that as psychological play, let the conversation today be an unfoldment of your curiosity and your ability to question consumed or assumed versions of reality. I'm Adam Knox, and remember to live deliciously.
Yeah, so the definition of a vampire, to me, is it's a being. It can be a human being or an entity with the permanent, fundamental need to exchange energy. So the key words are permanent, fundamental, exchange, and vital energy. So those four kind of main areas. So it's got to be permanent to meet the criteria of being a vampire, in my opinion. It's got to be a fundamental need, which means that without it, the vampire will sicken and have issues with their health and ultimately potentially die. It needs to be an exchange because there's a misunderstanding in a lot of vampirism that it's one-sided, that it's parasitic. It's not, it's symbiotic. And so that exchange is certainly not even. I say, 90-10, 80-20, that sort of thing, but there's an exchange of energy. So permanent fundamental need to exchange, and then vital energy. So all living things process universal energy, and we're exchanging energy all the time. You and I talking, even at this great distance, in America versus South Africa and online, we're exchanging energy right now just by chit-chatting. But however, there's a difference between that and that exchange of vital energy, and that's what the vampire needs. And so that's how I define vampirism. So that's the difference between that versus, let's say, being vampiric.
That's a good kind of, I think, opening frame. And I want to kind of expand on it a little bit, because what type of vampire are you, so to speak? And I want to just throw that in terms of context. And the reason for my specific context is because folks on the channel have listened to the views of Webb and the vampiric orders in terms of the Order Temple of Set. They've listened to the views of Indy Blackwood and his views of the Green Order and that type of vampirism. And you're giving a very different kind of perspective and a position of it. Help me frame this. where do I see your approach to vampirism, the types of vampirism, and how it compares to what the audience has learned or seen from these other teachers?
Yeah, so first, great deal of respect for both of them. I use them both as references in my book that's coming out in August, Living Vampires. So definitely, they both know what they're doing. They're both very accomplished practitioners, and that's what I would say. I would consider them to be vampire practitioners. So they're practicing a form of vampirism, and they have similar goals to what a lot of vampires have. However, it's a practice for them, as opposed to what I would call myself, which is a state of being. So my definition of vampirism, with that permanent fundamental need to exchange energy, which certainly differs from their definition, that's a state of being. So that is simply what we are, or what I am. So we can also practice vampirism. So there are vampires that engage in an active vampire practice that might look very similar to Blackwood's or Webb's works, and often it does. But then there's vampires that simply exist and they just go about their normal daily life and they do their thing as vampires. So that's really the big differentiator, is that it's a state of being as opposed to a practice, although it can also be a practice if the vampire chooses.
So when you say a state of being, because obviously now we're moving a little bit deeper in terms of the channel that we're on and the subject matter that you and I have been speaking about, and we're not simply talking about pure state. We're not just talking about simple identification like it is a gender identification role. We're talking about something, I imagine, that has a few deeper layers in terms of what the fundamental experience of consciousness is like for that individual, or what is this an initiatory kind of process that they evolve into? Is it something that's fundamentally inherent in their existence? Paint this a little bit with more detail for me.
Yeah, so and we could go into a lot of different directions in that. So first, the idea of a state of being is that most vampires will say you're simply born a vampire, and that's what we mean by state of being. And I don't disagree with that, in the sense that in my definition of vampirism, the vast majority of vampires are simply born a vampire. And then we have what's called awakening, where you awaken to it. You become aware of it. Kind of like you become aware of the occult at some point. You decide you want to pursue that. You want to pursue initiation or pursue magic. So we have what's called an awakening. Most often it happens around puberty or the late teens. It can happen at any point in time, though. So there are some vampires that awaken very early as young children. There's some that don't awaken until their 50s. But there's this light bulb moment, this aha moment, where they're like, something's different about me and I need to do this thing, and this thing is exchanging energy, or in some cases taking in blood. I don't do that, and so I tend not to talk about sanguinarian vampires very often. So that's the one thing in terms of what I'm talking about, a state of being. It can also be initiatory. Now, this is where I'm going to differ from a lot of vampires. A lot of vampires in the vampire community will say it's a state of being, either born one or you're not. Anything else is simply a vampire practice. They're wrong, in my opinion. I'll say that. I think they're wrong. They're not wrong in the sense of like what they are for them. Absolutely. And that's not like a pat on the head, like absolutely, like I'm being very genuine about that. But they're wrong in that there are a couple of vampire orders that do initiate, and they can turn people into a vampire, where it now becomes a state of being for that person as well. So there's an actual turning, which of course, a lot of people think that that's, mythology and it's something out of Hollywood. And there's very few vampire groups that actually do that. But in the Kheprian Order, and there's some other orders as well, when we actually initiate somebody, we're actually changing them, turning them, if you will, into a vampire. So now it is their state of being. They're also likely going to be actively engaged in a vampire practice as well. And that's part of the reason why they're doing the initiation. So you kind of cross over there, where it's not just a state of being born into it, but you can also be initiated into it and transformed, quite literally transformed into one.
Quite literally transformed into one. So let's move between the Hollywood perspective of what that is. I mean, the Vampire Lestat and Interview the Vampires, it's quite popular at the moment, and I'm sure there's a lot of like young goths listening to the channel going, okay, but where do I get a master to bite me? How does it work? Explain to me the difference between the fantasy fiction Hollywood version of a vampire and the actual reality of this process, especially this process of transformation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we could myth bust for a while. I'll leave that for a while. But basically, most of the myths are completely myths. There's no real truth to them. In my book, I get into the background on them and why they came about. There's a couple that there's some truth to, that we can talk about at some point if you want. But really, it's this transformation. Like, let's get into that because that's to me juicier and it's a lot more, in my opinion, honestly important. So, vampire initiation alters the person's subtle body. So when I say subtle body, think energetic body, etheric body. Some people might call it the astral body. I call it the subtle body, the chakras, the energy meridians, that energy body that we have. Okay, so subtle body. It alters that on a fundamental level. And when I say fundamental level, I don't mean here where you and I are now. I mean at a higher self level. So our initiations and these transformations don't occur at the Sean level. They occur at the higher self level of my being. And by doing that, this also makes the vampirism permanent. It actually carries through multiple lifetimes. So we believe that you basically carry it through lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. So this alteration, this metasurgical operation, which is a magical operation, an energetic operation, and ritual, this transforms the person at such a high level that not only do they become a vampire, but their future selves will also now be born vampires. So they will be born in their next incarnation as a vampire. It also allows them to avoid what, I think, well, Webb talks about it. I think Blackwood might as well. This also helps them avoid the second death, helps us remember our past lives a lot better. So we start off with that. It's an end goal for a lot of other groups. In the Kheprian Order, we start off with that once we're initiated. It's basically part of that transformation into being a vampire. So there's no biting involved. There's no blood involved. There doesn't even necessarily have to be physical contact involved, although we usually do have physical contact with the initiates. I obviously can't say a whole lot about the initiation itself, but I can assure people that there's no biting and no blood. It's not like that at all. It's a metasurgical operation that occurs in the realm of very close to the higher self. So not quite where the higher self is, but very close to where that is. And it's permanent, and that's what the transformation is. So when I say literally turning into a vampire, a lot of initiatory groups, they have a symbolic death and rebirth ritual. The Masons have it, as a very famous mainstream example. A lot of groups have it. Even certain fraternities and sororities have it. Obviously, even magical groups have it. In the Kheprian Order, this transformation, you literally die in terms of your energy body. Your energy body actually undergoes a death and rebirth. And so that's the transformation into a vampire. So there's actually an energetic death. Not physical, of course. Nobody's physically dying, but energetically, there's a death and rebirth that goes on. So it's a literal death and rebirth as opposed to a figurative one, or an allegorical one, or a simple magical one.
It's really fascinating. I've recently had a conversation with John Dennis Gobert about the Qigong practices in a variety of different traditions, and he spoke about how a variety of practitioners in Qigong restructure their energetic body in such a way that they can't enter the heavens anymore at a certain point because of how massively altered it is. They almost have to die some lifetimes, and it takes time to restructure that energetic body, but it achieves a certain psychic outcome or ability or power or capacity that they have. And the reason I bring that up, the reason I find that interesting in alignment with this, is you mentioned the almost restructuring of a state that you say is just pre-higher self, where this manipulation, this alteration, this death, rebirth, transformation energetically happens. The question that I'm going to, or the rest of that part of that frame, is Blackwood would, for example, speak about the separation of God into the vampire bloodline, or into, there's other names obviously for it, but one becomes part of that group or that astral body or that hierarchy, and there's a permanent transformation and a permanent rejection of the natural, quote unquote, order of things. These can seem frightening, they can seem confusing. What exactly, especially because the utilization, you refer to this alignment with the higher self, or this communication with the higher self, which is slightly different from, again, orders like the Green Order and others. Tell me a little bit more about that. Help me understand that mechanism and that difference a little bit more technically.
First, we're not becoming gods, at least in our view in the Kheprian Order. The Kheprian Order, as an order, is essentially agnostic in the sense that we have Roman Catholic members, we have Buddhist members, we have witches, we have pagans. So we're not theistic at all as an order. Individually, some of us are. I'm very theistic individually, but some of us aren't. We even have like the odd atheist member. So in that sense, the belief pattern is very across the spectrum. And so we're not trying to become gods. We're definitely trying to become more powerful and augment ourselves for sure. You used a word that's really, really important. You talked about almost like this sense of being unnatural. I want to touch on that. There are vampires on this planet that seem to have always been here, and they are natural vampires for all intents and purposes. They're part of the natural order. Kheprians are not that. We are not part of the natural order. We are unnatural beings. We're breaking the rules. And so in that sense, it's very unnatural for sure. But you do have both. You have natural vampires, states of being. I don't know how they make other vampires. I don't know if they even can. And then you have unnatural ones, which is, these are the ones that have been altered and transformed. And that's one of the ones that I am. So definitely unnatural in that sense. And you do, because of doing that, you are breaking rules. And by breaking rules, there's benefits and drawbacks to that. So one of the drawbacks is the various deities and god forms and more powerful beings that are out there. Some of them get pretty pissed off that we do this. You know, they don't like that we're doing this because we're kind of gaming the system a little bit or cheating the system. We're taking shortcuts, if you will. But on the flip side, you get more power. You automatically get a little bit more respect in subtle reality with various beings, astral reality, astral plane, ethereal plane. We just call it subtle reality in general. Sometimes we differentiate it by calling subtle reality and deep subtle reality. But you get a little bit more respect, a little bit more power, a little bit more influence. But you also get some enemies because they don't like what we do. So we are definitely unnatural, for good or for ill. We're unnatural. And it would be interesting about how you said about whether or not, could get into heaven or get into wherever that's supposed to be, happy hunting grounds, wherever we're supposed to go. I don't know if we can get into there, but we're choosing not to. We choose to come back. So regardless of whether or not we can, we don't want to. We want to stick around here. That's part of the intent, is to stick around here and keep on incarnating, growing in power, then eventually going somewhere else. But it's probably not what most people consider heaven or like I said, Valhalla or anything like that. Now, in terms of the technicalities of the alteration, I have to think about what I can also talk about, of course, too, because some of it's initiatory oath-bound. But essentially, the metasurgical alteration is a collaborative project between the initiator and the initiated, the higher self of the initiator and the higher self of the initiated, and sometimes with the other people that are present in the ritual. So a lot of Kephrians will work in triumvirates. So sometimes it's a collaborative project with 2 other people or even 4 other people, but it can be individual. And when I say collaborative, we don't initiate anybody unless their higher self gives permission. And we don't do it. We have 3 main specific alterations or initiations that we do. The only ones we'll do are what their higher self gives permission for. So for instance, if you're seeking initiation, like, oh, Sean, I really want to be Kephrian, and I asked your higher self, and your higher self said no, I'd be like, I'm really sorry. It's a no. I know you want it, and you'd be like a great Kephrian, but can't do it. Your higher self says no. And if your higher self says yes, you're like, I really want to have the warrior alteration, and your higher self only wants you to have the priest alteration. They're like, listen, I'm really sorry, I can initiate you, but your only option is priest. So we're very strict about that. So it becomes not only consensual, but it's informed consent, because the higher self has the ability to do informed consent. Our lower selves can't. Most of us can't comprehend the idea of a multi-lifetime commitment, but our higher self can. And so because of that informed consent, and because we're going to the higher self, it becomes very collaborative. And so when we go up, if you will, for lack of a better term, up to the higher self to do this surgical operation or metasurgical operation, we're also teaching that person's higher self how to do it. So they can also their higher self can ultimately do it on themselves if they ever need to in a future lifetime, if something goes wrong. So it's collaborative. It's instinctual. There's not okay, I'm moving this meridian in this chakra and doing this now. It's going up there, and things happen at that level, and then it comes down to where we are. That's about the best way I can describe it, and probably the most technical I can, with also not violating certain things that I just can't talk about, right? But that's most of it. That's most of it, and I'm allowed to talk about all that. So
I'm very curious about the moral stance and the ethical stance that I keep hearing, undertoning a lot of what you're communicating. And I mean, I can have an apologist argument. I can have, is that the full story? Is there a reason behind it? So I'd like to kind of get that perspective. Is it a case of we're throwing a lot of ethics on the table just to go like, we're not scary, we're actually safe, but behind the scenes, we're actually doing a lot of blood rituals and, everyone dies. To add the Hollywood kind of persona there. Why is the ethical stance so important in these decisions? Is it, I don't want to take responsibility for someone else's BS? Is there another reason for this? Where, especially considering the concept of a vampire predominantly being viewed as predatory in terms of its nature, especially in a variety of different cultural groups that are vampiric. Why strong emphasis on almost a purity ethical position inside of these decision makings?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things to that. So first, historically in the Kheprian Order, we were basically bonked on the head and press ganged into service, if you will. So we did it. It was done without our permission. So I was initiated, multiple lifetimes ago. I was initiated without my permission, without my consent. And some people didn't like that. Some people got pretty pissed off. Some people had some pretty severe psychological issues with that. The initiation back then was also a lot more harsh and aggressive, and really messed with people's brains throughout multiple lifetimes. And so, we can initiate people without their permission. We have the power, but we choose not to. And the reason being is that we think that that's an old way of doing it that's not necessary in today's society, and that we want people that want to be in the order and that want to grow with us and want to be with us for multiple lifetimes, not people that have been basically forced into service, if you will, or forced into the order against their will or against their consent. Willing participation, I think, is a lot better than unwilling participation, and when that's the feeling of the order overall. So that's basically why we're doing it that way, and why we're so hyper aware of informed consent, because we absolutely believe that the lower self can't give informed consent. Like, even as an experienced occultist, you can be like, okay, well, I understand, this change of the metasurgical system. I understand, the vampirism. You still can't give informed consent for multiple lifetimes, because most people just don't comprehend that. That's how we look at it, right? And it's not an ego thing. It's an experience thing. So that's kind of that part. Having said that, are vampires predatory? Absolutely. I think any vampire that says that vampires aren't predatory, they're either lying to themselves, to whoever they're talking to, or they're being delusional. So absolutely, vampires are predatory. We're inherently predatory. We're, eating people, right? Like, we're taking their energy. Now, it's an exchange, like I said, but we're taking their energy. A lot of vampires do it without consent. Some vampires do it with consent. Some of us are somewhere in the spectrum as to how we do it with consent or not consent, depending on how we're taking their energy. So we're absolutely predatory. We're inherently predatory, whether we're a natural vampire, practicing vampire, like Black Wood and Web, or one that's been altered, like myself. We're all predatory, absolutely. Where we fall on that spectrum is really what differentiates individual vampires, and also some orders. So some orders tend to, be more predatory. Temple of the Vampire would be a good example of a pretty predatory order. And they're talking about people that are being cattle. Basically, it's about the extreme end of predatory. You've got other groups that that are very much like, we won't do any sort of fitting at all without as much informed consent as possible. So you have both ends of the spectrum. The Kheprian Order, I'm going to say, is somewhere in the middle, with individual members kind of hovering to the left or right. And when I say left or right, I don't mean right wing or left wing in terms of politics, but left or right in terms of predatory versus not. And whatever one you associate as more predatory isn't really neither here nor there to me. It's just, we tend to hover around the middle, plus or minus a few points, if that makes sense. So some of our members are extremely predatory, some of them are extremely not, but most of us hover around the middle. We try and have that middle of the road kind of thing. But yeah, absolutely, all vampires are predatory.
Strike the balance however you choose with your own moral ground, really. Your journey, though, included everything from Roman Catholicism, Wicca, healing, a whole kind of slew in occult processes. One of the things that I've always found very interesting for different occult practitioners is how your personal experience of your consciousness altered through those different stages of development to where you find yourself or where you find it today. How did I'll break this into two questions so we can kind of evolve onto it. Let's start with, how did your identity move through these stages to the point where what you are experiencing now, especially if we look at like some of those commitments and statements, it's a multi-lifetime tier commitment. Yep. What brought you to that point of realization that this was something that you genuinely went from a belief, an idea, to an almost self-verified reality where you know that this is the operational process, at least for you. What
Yeah.
was that like? What is that like?
So for me, I always knew I was different. I've been involved in things since I was 4 years old, at a 4-year-old level, of course. I had a haunting in my home. I was reading about the paranormal, so ghosts and ghoulies and the Loch Ness Monster, all at a 4-year-old level. Um, uh, in my teenage years, started to get more involved, as you said, Wicca and stuff like that. I grew up in a small town. There wasn't a lot of options to me. You had books on Satanism, you had books on Wicca. I read both and I gravitated more towards Wicca, you know. Ironically, in a small town, we had books on Satanism. It was very interesting. But yeah, it's really bizarre. But in my teenage years, I read a book by Rosemary Ellen Guiley called Vampires and Monks. And I read that. I'm like, I think these are my people in the sense of like a generic overall thing. Like none of them specifically were me, but I'm like, I could really identify with what these people were doing. I'm like, man, I think I might be a vampire. I'm like, that's crazy. I can't be a vampire. Like what? That's crazy. And so I was kind of exploring it as a teenager in a small town, trying to figure it out. And I'm like, do I just want to be cool? Because I was the goth kid. I'm like, no, because I'm not talking about it. I'm not telling anybody I think I'm a vampire. So it's not about being cool. Like, what is this? And I got to university, I met some other people that kind of were thinking the same thing and we're trying to figure it out. And it kind of grew from there. For me, I definitely started realizing there was weird indications. So I would have people say, oh, it's really hard to look you in the eyes. Your eyes are so intense. You're looking into my soul. You move differently. You're intense in general. Like just certain things that can be psychologically explained, but they're also markers potentially of vampirism. They're markers of a lot of things, but when you have enough of them together, they can be markers of vampirism that in hindsight were markers. When I was in my early 20s in university, that's when I met other people that were kind of interested in vampirism too, thought that they might be vampires. So we're all exploring together, trying to figure it out. So we're on the old Usenets, the Usenet vampire, alt vampire and stuff like that, trying to figure stuff out. You got role players on there, you got practitioners, Temple of the Vampire members were on there, people that were interested, people pretending to be immortals, and then seekers like myself. So we're all trying to figure this out. We're all kind of in it together, but also individually. And that's when I knew and realized, oh man, I need energy to basically function correctly. And I felt bad. Like, so every vampire goes through this. Any vampire where it's a state of being, we all go through this where we wrestle with extreme predator versus feeling super guilty. And I started off feeling super guilty. So I felt so bad that I would be more intimate with people, sometimes even to the point of sex, because I felt so guilty that I was taking their energy. I was like, well, they want me romantically and sexually, so I'll give that to them so I can take their energy because I felt bad, and so basically whoring myself out, quite honestly and bluntly, and not deliberately and not in the sense of like, doing it for money or anything like that, but like basically doing this exchange of like intimacy and sexual stuff so I could take their energy. And then at some point, I realized, well, wait a second. If this is just what I am, then I shouldn't feel bad at all. Does a wolf feel bad that they're a wolf? Does a lion feel bad that they're a lion? So then I flipped to the opposite end of the pendulum, and I was extremely predatory. I wasn't quite like humans or cattle, but I'm like, okay, no, like I'm a predator. I'm going to eat who I'm going to eat and take the energy, and it's all good. And again, obviously, nothing physical without consent. That's a totally separate line. But energetically, I just didn't care. I did what I wanted to do. And that was, so the feeling really bad about myself was probably 2 or 3 years, the predatory, maybe a year or two. And then it finally started to get an equilibrium and a balance. I'm like, wait a second, like this is, I'm being kind of crappy here. I'm being a bit of a crappy human being, and, being a bit of an S head, if you will. And so I'm like, I don't feel bad about what I'm doing. I don't feel like I need to be like I'm other, it's vampires versus humans type of deal, right? I'm better or more evolved. I'm just me, and I just need to do what I need to do, and I can be an ethical wolf. I can be an ethical lion, if you will, an ethical predator, and that's kind of where I fell. And so I fell into the middle, probably about 5 or 6 years into my active conscious feeding. So now, I'm in 26, 27, and then right around then was when I found fellow members of the Kheprian Order. Found some online and thought, these people feel so familiar, man. And some of them were hanging out down in the States. I was in Canada at the time. And so I went to visit them and I started having memories. I started remembering some of them and having instincts about people. And then somebody would be like, do you think this person was blah, blah, blah? I'm like, yeah. And so that's kind of how it started. There's just this flash in the pan, if you will, of awakening and awareness that I was with what I didn't have a name for it at the time, but with what I call in my book, my soul group. And so that's kind of how it happened for me. So it's kind of like, oh, I might be a vampire. That's weird and crazy. I feel bad. Humans are cattle. Now I'm being a bad person, somewhere in the middle, and then finding my soul group. And that's kind of how it happened over a course of about 10 years.
That's good. That's quite a process.
Yes.
Can I get more technical?
Yes.
So tell me about vampire feeding as a process, and not just I'd like to understand what is vampire feeding, obviously from you as a teacher of vampirism, knowledgeable about that, how you would teach it. But what I am very interested in is how that started for you, how that's evolved. And I mean, not just in terms of intentionally or understanding, but has it moved from purely imaginative to kinesthetic? Did it start off as a kinesthetic? Did it was it self-delusion at one point and then there was a breakthrough? Or did you have immediate tactile sensation of energy with an impact of yours on that? Before we even look at how that kind of evolves, help me understand that.
Yeah. So early on, I was doing it by instinct. I was what we call an unconscious vampire, or some people say spy vampire or psychic vampire. I just use the term vampire. I don't like the precursors to it personally. Not insulted by it. I just don't use those terms. So it was very unconscious because I didn't know what I was. So a lot of my feeding would be through eye contact, which is why people would make comments about my eye contact with people, because it was unnerving for them because they didn't know what was going on, and neither did I. But I was basically feeding on them through eye contact, and through physical sensations. So through cuddling with a partner, kissing them, sex as well, any sort of intimacy like that. I wasn't good enough or strong enough, other than with the eye contact, to really do it at any sort of distance. I needed very close proximity. I needed to have physical contact. As I grew in power and ability and knowledge, both occult-wise and energetically, and just everything like that, that's when I started to realize, oh, okay, I can do this at a distance. I can do this in a nightclub where people are giving off a lot of sexual tension or a lot of just energy in general because they're all dancing. I go to nightclubs where people dance. And so there's a lot of sexual energy there. There's a lot of tension, sometimes aggression, depending on the kind of nightclub. So there's aggressive energy too. Actually, the one nightclub I would go to 4 nights a week, there would be brawls, like volatile brawls. So there was a lot of energy and the sexual tension too. So that's when I realized, okay, I can take aggressive energy. I can take this sensual sexual energy that's just building up in the room. So I would then take it at a distance. So I would take it as it leaves people, which we call ambient feeding, but then I would also take it, and still do in both cases, directly from the people. So somebody who had a lot of sexual tension or a lot of aggression, I would hone in on them and basically dive in energetically to take that energy. And again, it's just still an exchange, but I'll say take because it's a 90-10. So for that technically speaking, there's different ways of doing it, different ways of visualizing it. The way that there's two main ways that I do it. One is when I look at the person, I'll breathe in and I'll create almost like a stream of energy from them to me, directly in my mouth, but also through my eyes, palm chakras, that sort of thing, if I'm holding out my palms. But I'll breathe in and kind of almost like suck in that energy. So with a very non-glamorous look at it, think of it like a straw attaching from me to them, right? I'm like sucking in that energy, if you will, right? But not that aggressive. It's more like like that, as opposed to like that sort of thing, right? So not sucking like a straw, but breathing it in. The other way that I'll do it is I'll send out a tendril of energy attached to the person, their subtle body, not their aura. The aura for me is an emanation of the subtle body. I see it as very not a whole lot of substance. So attach it to their subtle body and take the energy through that tendril. So think of almost like fishing line with a little hook on the end. The nastier vampires are the ones that don't know, use barbed hooks. The nicer ones like myself, think of it like a very almost like knife point or straight razor blade. And it goes in, it slices in, sticks in there, and then you gently pull back and you pull back the energy and pull it back along that fishing line, if you will. But the fishing line is hollow. Again, almost think of it like a straw fishing line, and you bring in the energy through that fishing line or that tendril. I call it tendril of energy. But for people that aren't familiar with that, if you think of like a fishing line with a hook on the end, that's the best way to describe it from a physical point of view. So that's how I do it, is basically with that fishing line or that tendril of energy, or by simply breathing. And that's how I started doing it in my early 20s. And then it got more and more and more refined. Nowadays, I'm passively doing things like that all the time. So I passively send feelers out and tendrils out to people all around me and hit them with it and then take in energy. But because I'm doing it passively, it's like hitting one, taking a little bit of energy, detaching, hitting another one, taking a little bit of energy, detaching. So it's like little samples as I'm walking by, if you will. And I do that passively. I can do it actively as well, and I do. But I do it passively now. I've just gotten to a point now where I've been doing it for so long, and the energy that I deal with, that's a consistent thing that I do.
So I want to analyze that one level deeper and then ask a supporting question to it.
Yeah.
So there's the visualization or the active imagination component of representing the energy coming in through whatever meta model works. I use Cthulhu tentacles or octopus-like tentacles.
Yeah.
My thing. And I like that kind of metaphor. But then there's the breath, which I like, which is also something you see in Taoist techniques as well as a way to move. So the other layers, I want to find out how important or not important are any of these. A kinesthetic sensation in the body versus an emotional feeling of receiving, versus a hunger or need that pulls almost biologically in the body for drawing the energy in, versus and then so I'm trying to get a sense of the clarification of how much of those tiers are required. Is that something that evolves over time? Is any of that even necessary for you or not? And then the contrasting difference between feeding on another versus feeding on the environment, the planet, the stars, the moon, things like that, as you actually see a lot in Eastern practices as well. So what's your thought? If you can give me a little bit more on those?
Yeah. I may have to get you to repeat some of that. That's a long one. So I think it was Blackwood, and I apologize to Blackwood if I'm wrong. I think it was Blackwood who was talking about manufacturing almost like this need and this hunger so you can draw in even more energy. All right, so I'm correct in remembering that. We don't need to do that. We don't need to manufacture anything. It's there. That's what I mean about the state of being versus a practice, right? It's our state of being that certain vampires are always hungry. Others, feed once a week, once a month, and they're good. Some of us have to feed 2 or 3 times a week, taking energy 2 or 3 times a week. So we don't need to manufacture this hunger. So when you talk about, is this hunger necessary? This is part of what it is. So yeah, sometimes we feel it and we're going to feed more because we feel it, but it's kind of always there. Kind of like you might feel full after a meal, but you could also eat 15 minutes later a little bit or have a little nibble of something, right? Like physically speaking, it's the same thing with vampirism. We can get to the point where we feel full, but you can always take in a little bit more energy, right? And that sort of thing. So that part, it's not necessary, but it's always there. In terms of that emotional feeling or that kinesthetic feeling that you're talking about, that can be validation. You can also argue it's self-delusion, of course, or personal gnosis, of course, unless somebody else is witnessing it and perceiving it. It can be validation, but it's definitely not necessary other than if you're trying to validate something is working. And I mean, there's other ways to validate it too. You're going to feel certain ways as you take in the energy. So having an emotional response or a kinesthetic response is normal, especially for newer vampires in terms of the alteration initiation, but it's not necessary other than for self-validation, because if it's working or not. You just know. And that's a way to know, but there's also other ways just because of how it makes you feel, the energy in your body. When you're talking about almost like this imagination or visualization, like for me, some of the time I can actually see the energy flowing through. Most of the time I perceive it, and people then say they see it because we don't understand how to describe perception. But sometimes there's an actual almost physical seeing it, if you will, for lack of a better term, right? So there's a perception of it, there's a feeling of it, there's sometimes even almost like a physical seeing of it, but there's definitely a perception of the energy flowing, and that sense of it. And when I'm looking at the person's energy body, I don't have to perceive their energy body per se, but more often than not, I am, because I'm looking for certain things in terms of personally where I'm going to attach, if you will. Now, you talked about feeding on the elements and things like that. I've never understood that. I haven't met anybody that I consider to be an actual vampire that can only feed on the elements and survive, because that's not vital energy. So I think those vampires are potentially practicing vampires, or they're doing that, but they're also, feeding in other ways and, sustaining themselves in other ways is what I suspect. So there are people who describe themselves as vampires who do that. I know people who can, absorb energy from storms and stuff like that. I can do that sometimes too. If the storm is intense enough, I can kind of take some of the energy from that. But I don't find that to be a source of what I need to kind of function well. That's just a source of energy to do some magic. I would almost argue that's being more vampiric than being a vampire, because anybody can be vampiric. You're more than experienced enough. You probably already have it, right? You can be vampiric and take energy from people and use it to fuel your magic. That's being vampiric, but that's not necessarily being a vampire, because you don't necessarily need to feed to survive. So this whole elemental stuff, I'm very skeptical of as a way to survive. In terms of, can human beings do it? Absolutely. Can certain vampires do it, or practitioners do it to fuel certain magics? Absolutely. But as a thing to sustain us, I'm very skeptical of that. I'm open to being proven wrong, but I'm pretty darn skeptical of it. So for me, it really does need to be from a human being. It needs to be from an incarnated human being in a body. So I've taken energy from entities as well, but that still doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel as fulfilling or as filling, if you will. It does vary from person to person as well, though. So you're talking about like that kinesthetic stuff. Like I jokingly, but also seriously say that some people feel like cotton candy. And some people feel like steak, and I want the steak. I don't want the cotton candy. So if people are too fluffy, and I don't mean white light versus, a right hand versus left hand or anything like that. But if they're too fluffy to me, I'm not interested. I want something more substantial. So we find as vampires that the more awake a person is, the more experienced the person is in the occult, the more likely they are to be like steak. And then I'm actually at the point where my feeding preference is I prefer to feed on other vampires. So when I can, I actually eat other vampires as opposed to human beings now. So, because again, other vampires are a much heartier steak, if you will, right? Or they are the steak versus chicken or pork, that sort of thing, right? Sorry for the gross meat examples, but it's the best way that I can describe it. So there is that kind of kinesthetic or sense of substance.
But it makes sense, right? I mean, like, obviously somebody that is an active practitioner that's in the path has it's a more matured wine.
Yes,
bitter.
yes. Yeah, absolutely. That's another great way to put it. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. That's a much more elegant way to put it. I might steal that. It's way more elegant.
Where does the pool of blood flow, so to speak, in terms of in energy? So if I frame that in terms of, let's just take, for example, the Green Order. In the Green Order, the vampire feeds the chain, so to speak. Part of the initiatory requirement is kind of feeding the chain, and as such inheriting the abilities of the chain, or the body, so to speak, of black light, or how everyone wants to position it. What's the difference? How's that position? What's the position of the Kheprian Order?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Modern Kheprians, some Kheprians still think along similar lines. To what you just described with Blackwood. Most modern Kheprians see that as a vampire pyramid scheme, if you will. It doesn't make it less valid, and I say it with the greatest respect as much as you can by saying a vampire pyramid scheme. I'm going to talk about our own history too to soften what I just said. It still works. It's still absolutely valid. I would never say otherwise about Blackwood's practice. In the Kheprian Order, we used to have something similar, which is why I say that. So I'm also knocking us too when I say vampire pyramid scheme. So we had something called sharding. And sharding was where you would take a piece of yourself, a permanent piece of yourself, and in the initiation, you would pass that piece along to your initiate. And that would help empower them, but it would also make it so that whenever your initiate fed, they were feeding the chain, so to speak, right? They're feeding all the way up the initiatory chain. Thus, vampire pyramid scheme. So when I say it, I'm also talking about the Kheprian Order too, historically speaking. Okay, and there are older Kheprians that still have shards in them. They're still feeding that chain or pyramid scheme. We say pyramid scheme because the ones at the top get the most energy, and they're always kind of taking it from the ones at the bottom. And so it's great for the ones at the top, but the ones that are on the bottom are kind of getting a little bit of a raw deal, in our opinion. So that's why we could describe it that way. So we've been working to remove people's shards for the older Kheprians, so that, or for the OG, the original Kheprians, so that there's no more of that chain. There's no more of that scheme, if you will, so that people can stand on their own. And so for the new initiates, all the initiates that have happened since the 90s onwards, none of them have shards. None of them. And so we won't shard people. It's actually against anybody who belongs to like the modern order, because there's fractures in any group, right? There's temples that aren't in communion with the main temple, and that's fine. They do their own thing, and they're still our brothers and sisters in the Kheprian Order. They're just not in communion. But anybody in communion with the main temple, we are not allowed to shard people. It's against our rules. And so we have this chain of initiation by virtue of the alteration, but not quite the same, I think, as what Blackwood's describing. And nor would we want to have the same thing. There's definitely power in it. There's definitely advantages to it, but it also can, and I'm not saying anything that Blackwood does or what they're doing can do this, but through the sharding, at least in the Kheprian Order, you can really manipulate people and you can kind of get them to do what you want. They're not slaves, but there's a little bit of mind control going on, just a bit, right? Just a bit. So like, if you would do something, it just amplifies that, well, now you're more likely to do it, or you're more likely to help that person. You're more likely to listen to that person. And some people are like, well, that sounds amazing. But when it's within your own order, we feel like that's kind of dirty, if that makes sense. It's just kind of dirty to do that to your own brothers and sisters, so.
It's interesting. It's an interesting position. I like it. It's different and it's fascinating. And it kind of reminds me of, I think, I was speaking to Thomas Carlson of the Dragon Rouge ages ago, and we were talking about one of the reasons the Dragon Rouge has survived as long as it did, and how why certain black lodges or certain black orders tend to survive longer than others. And it's usually there's some code of chivalry, some set of higher ethics or higher rules, which are almost knighthood in their structure, that persists beyond the impulses, the drives, the flood of altered states of consciousness, the experiences of power or hunger or bloodlust or whatever may be born from within that expression. We've teased the name for so long and about the Kheprian Order, and anyone that's going to pick up the book is going to get a full kind of view of it. I want to get a little bit of insight of the initiatory processes or the alterations, not necessarily in full detail, but just in terms of from the outside of a non-initiate to the inside. What does that journey look like? What are some of the big major shifts that happen? And can this be done to someone in terms of transforming them into a vampire?
Yeah. So to be initiated, you have to find somebody who has the power to initiate you, because even though it's collaborative with the higher self, it takes a great deal of power. Has the knowledge to initiate you, has the willingness to initiate you, and then also has the authority to. So there's very few of us who have the authority to initiate others. So there's 4 criteria, right? So power, knowledge, wants to, and then also can, right? So we have some Kheprians that can, but they're not authorized to. We have others that have the power and have the authorization. They're currently not initiating people. And then we have some like myself that have all 4. So there's that. There's that aspect. After that, it comes down to individual temple criteria. So some temple are extremely, very, very picky. They might, initiate one person every few years, type of thing. Then there's some that are far less picky, where they're like mass initiations, because they just want to see as many Kheprians as possible. I'm again, surprise, I'm somewhere in the middle. I won't just initiate anybody. So I'm picky, but neither do I think, it should be, one person every 2 or 3 years. I want to see the order grow. I want to see the group grow. So there's all of that. Once you find that, you find that there's somebody that is willing to, and that it makes sense and it's good for you, then again the process will vary. So in some cases, especially the ones where it's only once every 2 or 3 years, they want to get to know the person, they want to interact with them on a friendship level, sometimes on a magical level, just to get a sense of what they are, and what their ethics are, where they're coming from, why do they want to be Kheprian, all that sort of stuff. Others, here in the New Orleans temple, I'm located in New Orleans. In the New Orleans temple, we go through typically a 1 year long initiatory process. So it's 1 year of training. So there's some initiatory groups, you get initiated and then your training begins. There's other initiatory groups where you get trained for a certain period of time and then you get initiated. So we opted for getting trained for about a year. And when we say about, it's not anything like, oh, it's a year and a day, or it's or it's 13 months. It's like, it's about a year. If it's 11 months, we're not worried. If it's 13 months, we're not worried. If it's about a year, there's just certain information that people need. It helps build that informed consent. as much as one can be for the lower self by getting some training of the outer order stuff. And then they go through initiation. So that's how we do it here in New Orleans. We try and model that to other temples. And there's other temples that have kind of followed suit with us. But there's others that do it a lot more quickly. And there's others, like I said, that take years of getting just to get to know the person before they'll do it. So it really does vary from temple to temple. In terms of the initiation is immediate. So once you're initiated, for all intents and purposes, you are immediately Kephrian and a vampire. There are some caveats to that. For some people, their higher self seems to hold on to it and kind of downloads it into them more slowly. And so their process of transformation is over weeks, sometimes over months, but usually over weeks. Others, the higher self is just like bang, and they are immediately completely transformed. And you're seeing, like, if you didn't know any better, you'd think you were looking at one of the original Kephrians, not somebody who has just been initiated. So I've seen both. I've seen it where it's a multi-week process or a multi-month process of the subtle body, dying slowly over time. And I've seen it where it is literally, essentially instantaneous for all intents and purposes. Like the initiation and the alteration is done. You step back and you look at them and they are fully transformed already. So, and sometimes eating people in the room because they're usually immediately really hungry, right? That is the one thing where the new vampire is super hungry. Yeah, the new vampires are usually pretty hungry. So we're prepared for that though, right? In the ritual. So it does vary that way. What we found is the ones that take longer are often the counselor initiation or alteration, and or people that are still holding on to their humanity, where it was more their higher self than them giving the consent. They gave consent. Like the lower self has to give consent too. Like we won't do it without the lower self's consent. Like it's a dual consent. I don't think I mentioned that before. But they're kind of rallying against the idea of eating people. They're rallying against being a predator. They want to be a vampire, but this idea of like eating people and being a predator is like And so those ones, the transformation takes weeks or months, where they slowly adjust to the idea that you're not human any longer. You're now what's called a spiritual immortal. You're a vampire and you're going to eat people and you're a predator. You can be an ethical predator, but you're still a predator. And so it depends. So it depends. So it can be very dramatic where you're like, holy smokes, and you can feel the energy coming into you immediately. Or it can be a little bit traumatic, which initiations can be traumatic, right? Where you're like, oh, I don't know about this. And it takes a few weeks to adjust and kind of balance yourself, if you will. So I've seen both. We haven't seen anybody, lose their mind, literally or figuratively. Initiation can make some people, in general, right? Not Kephrian initiation specifically. In general, initiations can make people go off the rails, so to speak. I don't say that lightly. It's just a reality. It's meant to transform you. All initiations are meant to transform you and kind of upend your life to put you where you need to be. And it does with the Kephrian alteration for sure. We try and give people pretty big warnings, though, so if there's not surprises. Like certain things we don't tell them because we don't want it to be psychosomatical, but certain things we tell people. So for instance, like with the priests, we let them know, like, you might feel the need to be more manipulative or more aggressive in terms of your energy feeding. You need to be aware of that. Be careful or decide what kind of person you want to be. Be aware of that. Our warrior alteration or initiation, there's a lot of issues with anger. And so we warned people about that. We initiated one guy who already had anger issues. He was warrior. And he thanked me a couple months later when I saw him. He said, Sean, if you hadn't have warned me, I would have been in big trouble. But because you warned me, I was able to work through the increased rage. So we have these kind of triggers and these warnings that we let people know. So, and then the counselors, sometimes there's an increased sense of sensualness or sexual activity. And so we let people know, like, make sure you know what you're getting into and that what you're doing is what you actually want to do. Whatever people's sexual recollections are and their ethics are, no problem, as long as it's consensual, of course. But make sure that that's actually what you want, and it's not the alteration affecting you. So the alteration affects everybody differently, but there's certain things that we have kind of markers depending which alteration people get and how far along they are in their occult journey. So somebody who's already kind of doing some predatory magic, they're going to adjust a lot better. Others who don't, it takes some time, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. There's different orders approach the kind of management of members differently, in terms of when they can't control their states. And I mean, like, let's be honest about like what we've just spoken about in terms of that initiation is a difficult process, and it can affect anyone in all kinds of ways. And that's not unique to the vampire orders. That's just occult initiations across the board. In fact, from Martinism to Masonry to everything. There's been stories, and there's been people that have cracked. You either make it, you either break it, or it's a transformation. And many orders have evolved systems, obviously to support that transformation. And then some orders would completely say, after you've been initiated, after you've done the thing, you're responsible for whatever you do. That's your own thing. Others take a more kind of hands-on, firm, ethical approach, saying, you can't do this or you can do this, and you kind of lose membership, if you do this. Out of curiosity, is there a counseling, supporting? Is there rules, or is there a vampire order or council that if somebody does go bad, go rogue in a way that may affect other members or anything else like that, that they're reprimanded or left to their own defenses? What's the perception inside of the Kheprian Order around those?
Yeah, so there's some variants, but there's some universal stuff. So the first we call them catch and releases. So we do some initiations where like they're initiated and then they're like, off you go, like here you go, like go out into the world, and do what you want to do, because they want initiation, they want to experience that magic, but they don't really want to be affiliated with a specific temple. So then they're affiliated with Grand Temple, but then that's it. And so for those ones, they're taught, where they should be ethically, what we suggest, how to survive. They know they can always come back and learn more, but otherwise they're on their own. And there's a subset of us that we definitely believe in, kind of survival of the fittest. The strong will weed out the weak. We also believe in defending the weak, but in the order, we're like, it's very much about strength. Like, stand on your own. Can you stand on your own? We'll help you. We also need to stand on your own. This taking responsibility for standing on your own. Where you have to be stronger.
This is the occult Udemy course.
Yeah, exactly. So there's that aspect of it. Within certain temples, some temples will have their own specific rules about certain conduct and whatnot, but we have stuff too in general. So, we tell people, you don't feed from children. You don't feed from people that are pregnant. You don't feed from the infirm. You don't feed from the insane. Some of that's self-preservation. You don't want to be feeding on people that are mentally unwell, because sometimes that can wear off onto you too, energetically speaking. You don't want to be feeding on the infirm, because the energy is not that good. And ethically, you shouldn't be feeding on either one, quite honestly. But also selfishly, you shouldn't. For children and pregnant women, it's very much ethically. Children have lots of energy, but we frown on that. We consider that to be way too predatory. And because a woman is pregnant, there's a belief, depending on which member is which, that at some point, whether it's on conception or at some point along the way, there's a baby, like there's a child in there. And so then you don't feed on the pregnant woman. And also to adversely affect the pregnancy, because if enough people are feeding on somebody, will that child awaken earlier than they should? Will they awaken when they weren't going to this lifetime? How will it affect the mother? So it's much about the ethics of the mother and the growing thing inside of her, whether you believe it's a child or not. So that's kind of our ethics in terms of feeding. We also have ethics in terms of the type of feeding and whether or not consent is required. And so, people are expected to follow that. Some of them are suggestions. Some of them are, no, you need to do it this way. So we do have that. A lot of our stuff is also internal structuring. So, as as an experienced occultist, there's a lot of issues with predatory behavior within groups. Not just vampire groups, all groups, right? Wiccan groups have it, witch groups have it, where, a high priest or a high priestess or a leader will prey on somebody else in the group, often sexually, and without consent. And they're manipulating them in terms of like the power that they have. And so we have really strict rules in the order where if you have any sort of authority over another member, including just a higher degree, you're not even allowed to flirt with them. So we have very strict rules on that it has to be the lower degree that approaches you. And even some of our members don't even want that, but that was basically the decision, was that the higher degrees cannot in any way, shape, or form start anything. And it can't be a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, like, hey, if you flirt with me, we can flirt. Like, it's absolutely strict. And then also, so there's never any misconceptions, we also do not, under any circumstances, teach sex magic. We think sex magic's great in a lot of cases. I think it's great, but we will not teach it within the order. If people want to learn it, no problem. But we do not do any form of sex magic within the order itself. If members want to do it, no problem, like on their own. But within the order, we don't do it. We don't teach it. And that's, again, just so that nobody can ever feel like something's being taken advantage of or there's an issue. And then similarly to that, in the vampire subculture, there's a lot of crossover with BDSM. You mentioned the goth kids that are like, hey, how do I become a vampire, right? There's crossover with that too. We have no BDSM introduced into the Kheprian Order whatsoever. Some members are kinksters and, members of the BDSM community. That's separate. So just like if they were doing work with the Goetics or the Goetia or doing, Reiki even, that's separate from the order. Similarly speaking, if they're doing sex magic, BDSM, not that the two are necessarily related, they can be, that's separate from the order. And we're very, very strict on that. It has no place in the order. And that's, again, simply so that no one ever feels some sort of way. And there can never be any question about any manipulation going on a sexual level.
Those are also the things that destroy any kind of fundamentally long-lasting things because of human emotion and just the complexity of it all. So exactly. That makes a lot of sense. Tell me a little bit, and I don't want to go too deep because there's so much here, and we've already had quite a very in-depth kind of conversation. And I think it's just gotten a lot of people their appetites kind of, more watering, more ready for more of the idea. We probably had a few of them drop off when you said there's no BDSM sex parties. But that's okay. They'll find other videos on the channel to help them with those. But the order's history in terms of where it's perceived on both what is accepted, what's believed, what is personal unverified gnosis. There's this recount of Atlantis and the Fallen Watchers and this stolen metasurgical technology. Tell me about that. How is it used? Give me this little juicy insight into the inner workings if we can.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so this is where it's, if it wasn't weird before, it's going to get weird. And then I'm quite cognizant that some people are going to think I'm absolutely, batty or bonkers, and that's okay. Or that Kheprians are in general. It's our cosmology. Some of it you can look at it through history and be like, okay, there's the touch points. Others you can't. Others contradict certain history that we know, and we're aware of that too. Egyptologists and I have had conversations where we're like, this is not aligning, and we're aware of that. There's other authors that have talked about that too, about cosmology. So I just want to put that out there. Like, I am aware of that, and I'm aware that some of it will sound out there. So I have found that in a lot of magical orders and a lot of teachings, you seem to have this precursor or progenitors, whether it's a race, a group of beings, aliens, fallen watchers, whatever it is, that seem to hang out, the gods, that seem to hang out and teach humanity these cool things, this cool technology. And so we're no different in that sense. We have the same cosmology. Our cosmology is directly tied to the fallen watchers. So the watchers that were, in the watchtowers watching over humanity, and the whole idea in the Book of Enoch where they're like, look at humanity. They're pretty cool. Let's go down there and hang out with them. And then they taught them magic. So, we have that cosmology, to skirt the surface of that. We're tied, in our opinion, to very specific watchers. And there's reasons for that, and there's other cosmology behind that. But in general, the fallen watchers, that 200, that came down with Sanyaza or Sanhaza, and that group, right? So that's what we kind of tie our origin stories to, and so that's part of it. That eventually gets into what we call Adelan, what you called Atlantis. We use the term Adelan. Atlantis isn't an insult or anything like that. We recognize it as Adelan. That's what we remember it as, the best way to English it, if you will. And it sounds a little bit less new agey, to be honest, at least, right? So Adelan is where we first start kind of remembering stuff about the order. So some of us have past life memories before that. I do. I've got one past life memory before that time period. But I wasn't doing a whole lot other than hanging out in a cave, like literally hanging out in a cave. So we have Adelan, and Adelan is, as people describe it, Atlantis. And there was a lot of interesting technology there and a temple there that of metasurgeons, and they were healers. They were essentially healers. They were diviners, pretty peaceful people. Pretty kind and nice people, and they were really skilled metasurgeons. And a few of our original members of the order were in this temple, and we're like, well, hey, we're pretty sure we can apply this technology this way if we do it this way, if we do this. And so we stole the technology from them. And when I say we, I say the order, not me. I was initiated later on, and but the collective we as an order, we stole this technology from them. And so, we're not going to sugarcoat it. They didn't give it to us. We took it, we stole it by force. We stole it. And I'll leave it at that in terms of like what that means. But we stole it and we experimented with it and came up with the alteration. So the first alteration was the priest alteration, or the first initiation. The second one that we came up with was the counselor alteration. And then the third one was the warrior alteration. And then over the years and over thousands of years, there's been kind of some sub alterations that we can do as well, or different alterations. And not sub as in BDSM, but just subsets, if you will. But those are the three main alterations. And so the first priests were altered, and then the first counselors, and then the first warriors. And so that's what you have. You have these original 72, or by some accounts 73, other accounts 74, depending on memories and what you consider to be a true Kheprian or not, but essentially 70 plus original Kheprians, these original Kheprians. And so you've got approximately 30 counselors, 30 warriors, and then the balance of them are priests. And that's where the differing numbers come in. It's 30, 30, either 12, 13, or 14, depending on whose memory and what you believe. So even in the order, we can't fully agree. And you see, you have these original 72. And then after that, you had a second string of Kephrians and then a third string. I'm in the second string. So I was in the beginning of the second string of Kephrians, where a lot of us were altered, a lot more than 70 of us. And then again in the third string. And that's kind of like the core foundation of the order before it expanded. But it was stolen metasurgical technology from a temple in Adelan, or Atlantis. And that's where we start. So you have these kind of primordial mythological places, right? You have Adelan or Atlantis, you have Lemuria and Mu, and our cosmology, our mythology, our belief system, though, like we do take it literally, not allegorically. The vast majority of us comes from Adelan. That's where we are from, as opposed to one of those other mythological primordial places.
Kephrian, what's the disagreements that we seem to have here in the book?
Yeah. So, oh man, this is gonna be spilling some tea, but it's the tea is spilled in the book too. So there's a whole line of thinking that our founder is a Kheprian priest by the name of Sedum Onsi, or Onsi. Sedum is a title, and most Kheprians for a long time kind of drank that Kool-Aid, if you will, that Sedum Onsi was our founder. There are more purists that say, well, wait a second, technically, first Kheprian that was altered before Sedum Onsi is our founder. And then there's some of us that say, well, actually, our founders are those original watchers. And so there's not a full agreement, but it's kind of in that kind of like, was it the first fallen watchers that came up with the idea? Was it this original priest? Was it Sedum Onsi? None of them are true. All of them are true, if you will, right? Like you could argue any of the three. And there's an argument for all three to be fair and objective. Either way, no matter how you look at it, Sedum Onsi essentially took over the order very early on. And almost everybody was sharded with a shard from Sedum Onsi. And it's carried on for a while. At some point early on, when things were still Adelan, if you will, ish, there was a disagreement, and there was a fracture in the order between one of the main priests. There's two priests under Sedum Onsi. There was a fracture in the order. One of the main priests, there was a fracture. It was stupid. It was ego. It was paranoia, but there was a fracture. And the order basically split mainly in two, Sedum Onsi camp and this other guy named Kamesh's camp. And there was a few of us that were like, y'all are bonkers for fighting each other. And we stayed neutral. And we were very few, who arguably not even really a third faction at that point in time, but there was a few of us, and I was among them. So there was a fight, there was a civil war, if you will. Groups break up, right? We see it, infighting, Golden Dawn, we saw, groups. In this case, it's just a lot more bloody because you could do that back then. So there was a civil war, and the order basically fractured essentially into two camps. And then when that happened, and some of the priests, because remember, we were initiated against our will, some of the priests were, well, wait a second, if Kamesh can leave, so can I. So you started having all these priests trying to leave and running their own temples. So you had minor fractures, and some were successful, some were not. And eventually, one of the other main priests that was under Sedum Onsi had a significant fracture and took about half of what was left of the order and did his own thing. And so this is over a period of thousands of years now. We're getting into the whole, Septepi, or the legendary times of Kemet, early Sumeria, stuff like that. So we're kind of fast forwarding a little bit. So by the time you get into Sumeria, maybe 4,000 years ago, you've got Kamesh's group, you've got Sedum Onsi's group, you've got this other group, Sin's group, or Nanasin's group, and you've got all these other subsets as well, these other smaller groups. Those are the three kind of main groups. And you have that going on, but with the idea that Sedum Onsi is still the leader of the order, you just have almost like splits within it, right? Not in communion, if you will. And you have this going on, for thousands of years. And then in modern times, there is a person that believes that they are Sedamansi, the incarnation of Sedamansi. And for a long time, a number of Kheprians believe that. The order is split on this. The order is split on, we all believe that the person believes that they're Sedamansi. We absolutely believe that they believe it. They're not lying. They absolutely believe it. What the order is split on is whether or not it actually is Sedamansi, or they actually are Sedamansi, or we had, and you'll see them sometimes, especially with dictatorships, you have like a body double, right? So that you don't get assassinated, your body double does. We had that in the Kheprian Order too, because of all the infighting, especially with some of the priests. And so the difference, though, in the Kheprian Order is that those body doubles would be essentially brainwashed or reprogrammed to have the same energetic structure as the original person, and even some of the memories of the original person. There would be metasurgical techniques to program them to have some of the same memories. So it's possible to have a body double who actually believes that they're the person with some of the same memories. And so there's some of us that believe that the person who claims to be Sedamansi is actually a body double, not the original Sedamansi, because a number of us believe that the original Sedamansi is dead, that the original Sedamansi can't come back in a body for all intents and purposes. So dead in the sense that not really reachable. There's like a beeping when you call them, if you will, right? No dial tone type of thing. And so, how do you reconcile this, though? Well, the idea is that, well, perhaps in this person who's saying they're Sedamansi, because we're universally believe that they are, is actually a body double. And part of that is the original Sedamansi should be able to do a lot more than what this person can, metasurgically speaking and magically speaking. This person is a very gifted occultist. They can do a lot of fun stuff that a lot of people can't do. They're not at the level that Sedamansi should be. And so either this person's been heavily nerfed, or bound, and they're Sedamansi, or they're not Sedamansi and they're the body double, and it makes sense that the body double wouldn't be as powerful. So that's kind of the whole thing about Sedamansi and whether or not Sedamansi even exists to lead the order anymore. A few years ago, there was a shift in the order where a number of members had the ability to break away completely and get completely free, essentially, of the egregore of the order. And there was discussion about whether or not to do it. And I was one of them. I was one of the ones that could have been free. And there was a discussion. I'm going to get emotional about it. It's very emotional for us. There was discussion about whether it was ethical and appropriate to abandon the order. And was the order salvageable or not? And it was a long discussion. It was actually a multi-year discussion, which culminated into something a few years ago, just about 3 years ago. And what culminated in that is that some members of the order felt the order was not salvageable. And most of us thought that it was, that we could turn the egregore around before it got hopelessly, irrevocably tainted. Because you can taint egregores, right, with a lot of infighting and badness, that just isn't good for the order. I'm not saying good or evil, like just not good for that particular order. And most of us, and I was among them, felt that the order was salvageable, that the egregore was salvageable, that we could salvage what was going on. And we're very I guess what's the word I'm looking for? Optimistic. There's another word I'm looking for, not high and mighty, but there's that kind of like, it's something similar to optimism, and the name escapes me. But in any case, so idealistic. There we go. We're very idealistic, right? And so magical things occurred, which that's all I can really say, as well as political things occurred and physical things occurred that changed for sure the leadership in the order, where whether it's Sedamansi or Sedamansi's doppelganger or the whole that should have been Sedamansi that's no longer there was supplanted by our new grandmaster. And so we have a new grandmaster of the order just within a few years ago. We've never had a grandmaster before. That's a new title as well. It was just Sedamansi. It's just the leader of the order, And so there was that kind of coup. You could call it a coup. It wouldn't be wrong. It was a bloodless coup, but it was a coup. And so you have a new leader in the Kheprian Order. You have a new drive. That's why we have these new rules about sexual behavior, sex magic, BDSM. We have these new rules. We used to be called castes. We did away with that term because we felt it was too heavily loaded with submission and slavery and disproportionate amounts of power. So we called them, before it was called alterations or castes, now we say alterations or initiations. And so there's this kind of evolution of the order, if you will. Ideally, one is a little bit more ethical, a little bit more moral, still predatory, still, we still know, we do painful stuff in healing and protective. We do all three, don't get me wrong, but just internally, especially something that's a little bit more positive internally for the members. And then you had this kind of branching out, a ripple effect where members of the order had to decide where they stood. And the Grandmaster took over with the blessing of the majority of the original priests, the majority of the original counselors, and a handful of the original warriors, and then a whole pile of other Kheprians. But ultimately, the majority of Kheprians, it was more than 50%. And that was why the Grandmaster agreed to do it. And so that's what the change was. So you have temples that are in communion with the Grandmaster, the Grand Temple. And that means they've taken new oaths. They've got the authority to alter people, that sort of thing. And you have temples that are not, and some by choice. So there's a temple out in LA that knows what's going on, knows everything that's happening, and they've just chosen, not to. You've got other temples that are not because they kind of were left in the dark, and that would be House Kheprian. They were left in the dark because it was believed that there's no way they'd be in communion with the Grandmaster for various reasons. And there's lots of stuff about House Kheprian, positive and negative. People need to do their own research on that and read what people have said and make their own decisions about that particular temple, that Kheprian temple, if you will. But it wouldn't be in communion with the Grand Temple. It's not the only one that isn't, but the majority of the active temples today are in communion with the Grandmaster. And the majority of Kheprians, we're still fractured. Don't get me wrong. There's still some following that guy named Nanasin. There's still some specifically following Kamesh. There's still some following Sedamansi and all these other little groups. But the vast majority of Kheprians are following the Grandmaster now, both in a body and without, because we hold a lot of weight with our disembodied. If we didn't have the support of the disembodied Kheprians, no matter what temple we are, we wouldn't function. It's a very collaborative thing between the two. So, from a Grandmaster perspective, I'm part of the Grandmaster's Triumvirate. So I'm one of the people that knows who the Grandmaster is. I get to know certain stuff and I help people out. I'm also one of the temple leaders here in New Orleans, one of the founders of the New Orleans Temple. I think I can safely say on behalf of the Grandmaster, from the Grandmaster's perspective, there's no anger, there's no hate. There's an understanding that not everybody's going to be in communion. There's a hope that everybody will, but there's no animosity from the new kind of orders perspective. Whether or not that's the same for everybody else will remain to be seen, especially after my book comes out. It'll remain to be seen. But I got permission for all of that, and that was really important to me, is that multiple elder Kheprians, if you will, we don't really use the term elder, but the original Kheprians, as well as other Kheprians and new Kheprians, all gave their stamp of approval on the Kheprian sections of the book. The rest I didn't care if they approved or not, because it's my interpretation of vampirism, and it's not about Kheprian stuff specifically, but 3 of the chapters are specifically Kheprian, and I wanted to make sure, do you agree with how I'm putting the history? Am I saying too much? Am I violating any oaths? Are you guys good with this? And so that was really, really important to me. So that's I guess that's kind of it in a nutshell. It's revealing a lot of drama, but I think it's also important to show people with transparency that, like, any order that tries to say that they're perfect, there's no infighting, it's all crap. I mean, everybody has some infighting. It's how you deal with it, and how you grow and how you transform, in my opinion. And we had a big one. We had a big transformation about it, for sure. And it remains to be seen where it goes.
I think you mentioned in the book that the abolishment of the chase and everything, that was like 2024. That's not too long ago. Or how long ago? It's fairly recent that's kind of moved into the balance. So I think this is also a nice communication for anyone affiliated or unaware, and gaining some insights and direct knowledge directly like that. So let me ask this one as a kind of bring it home, so to speak, if you will.
Yes.
So sadly, when you get initiated as a vampire, you don't suddenly have gigantic sex orgies and immortality that you can fly and you're instantly, inheriting billions of dollars. I guess maybe depends on which one. You can still have that, but like that's your own thing. It's not necessarily, the specific route. So what's daylight side? What's the day side like, if you will, of the vampire living in the tradition and dealing with the world that they're in today from the perspective of other people, introducing yourself as because it's very brave to just come out and say, I identify, I am a vampire. I don't just identify as one. This is what I am. This is how I perceive and experience reality. And you are still living in, tax and death and other environmental, factors and social groups. And there's expenses to pay and things like that. What's the closing counsel, right, in your experience, of how the initiating vampire, as well as the seeking transforming person, as well as the others that's just fully aware of this occult or nocturnal dimension of themselves and their world, how do they integrate into society? How do they manage the day side of all of this?
Yeah. So first of all, I love that you use that term because we borrow that. We're certainly not the ones who came up with that term, but we borrow day side, night side, and twilight from other people, groups, authors. And so the first part of that, which isn't really answering your question, but it's important to get to, is you have to have your day side together to be initiated. That's one of the criteria of initiation. You have to have it together. Now we're not saying that you have to be, in a mansion, but you need to be able to pay your bills, take care of your family if you have a family, or your pets or whatever you have a roof over your head, enough money for food, right? So paying your bills. Do you have power, water, feeding your family if you're responsible, pets, whatever, and, paying your bills. You have to have your day side together. And you can be working at McDonald's, you can be CEO of a company. We have both. We have the whole gamut. But you have to have it together. So it's not about living high on the hog, if you will. It's just about, do you have it together or not? That's a criteria for initiation. And then it's an expectation of all initiates that everybody will get to third degree. And that's first degree initiation. Second degree initiation is the night side, where now you're getting your night side together. You're learning more about vampirism. You've already been learning it hopefully for a year, but you're learning more about it. You're getting it together. You know how to do it in a vacuum on its own, not attached to your day side. And then third degree is integration. It's integrating the two. And so there is an expectation in the order that no one stays at first degree or second degree. You will get to third degree. That's the minimum expectation. You ideally really should get to fifth. And there's other things about that, but not related to what you're talking about. So there's an expectation that you will work towards getting to third degree and integrating it. So there's an integration aspect, not keeping it separate. Having said that, we have secret members of the order. We have a rule that we can't reveal the names of other members of the order unless they're already public. So as an example, you could be a member of the order and I can't say anything unless you're a public member of the order, right? So people, like that sort of thing, right? Like that's how secret it is. So it's up to the individuals if they come public or not and how public they are. So we have members that are completely secret. We have members that are like me, like completely public. And then we have members that are like within certain circles, they're public about it, right? So there's that as well. Part of the day side reconciliation is that whole integration into twilight, if you will. So it's third degree, where how do you reconcile feeding? How are you going to feed and still carry on your job? If you're working as a CEO, are you going to feed at work? What does that look like? If you're working at McDonald's, how are you going to feed? What does that look like at work? Or are you doing it on your nighttime time? Assuming you're working day shift, if you're working night shift, then how are you doing it on your daytime? So these are things that we look at, and it's ultimately up to the individual to figure that out. We can help, but it's up to the individual to figure out. So for instance, for me, most of my energy intake, I'm very fortunate. I live in New Orleans. So when I want to feed, I just walk down Bourbon Street. There's so much energy there, right? Hundreds, thousands of people on the street. Not everybody has that. We have vampires living in small towns or whatever, and certainly not a huge tourist city like that. So, I do that, or I go to a nightclub where, again, there's that sexual tension. There's not really aggression where I am now. Those nightclub days are behind me, but, there's the sexual tension and just the excitement and the dancing energy. So how people integrate it really depends on where they live, how they want to do it, how predatory they are versus not predatory, and whether or not they fully integrated into twilight. So for me, being public, owning occult shops here in New Orleans, being, as people put it, a professional witch, if you will, for lack of a better word, professional vampire, I guess, I'm very fortunate that way, right? Where I can be very open and it's not too weird, but it still can be. Like we've had people not go into our stores because they're like, there's vampires in there. I'm scared, I've had people find out that I'm a vampire. They're like, have you eaten me? Have you fed on me? Don't feed on me without permission. See, you still get that, right? Because of the bad rap some vampires get. A lot of people are like, oh, well, that's super sexy. So you get that too. You have to navigate that too. So how you do it is really up to the individual. You can keep it a complete secret and it's valid and it's good. And you can still be a very powerful vampire or a very powerful Kheprian. You can be very open about it and that's valid and it can be good and you can still be a powerful one. Either way, though, to me, whether it's secret or not, you have to learn how to integrate it. And that's a pretty universal belief in the Kheprian Order. If you're not getting to that third degree or twilight, you're not doing it well enough. You're selling yourself short. You're selling the order short. You need to be able to integrate it. And the key part being you need to be able to, as a function and as a member of society, whatever that looks like. But you need to be able to do both, and ideally as one. Another way that we put it is, I've talked a lot about ethics. Like you shouldn't do this, and we're making sure this isn't appropriate and things like that. Here's the thing, though. At the end of the day, especially if you really think about all the different things you could do, there's actually very few rules that we have. But we're really strict on those few rules. but we want everybody to transform into the best versions of themselves. And that's a really important part. We don't want people to transform into the most evil people. We don't want people to transform into the most good people, the most moral people, the least moral people, the most ethical, least ethical. We want them to transform into the best versions of themselves, whatever that is. That's one of the goals of the order. You transform yourself, then you transform the order, then you transform the world. And you start with transforming yourself, and you get to a point, and then you start transforming the order while you're still transforming yourself. And then you get to a point and you start transforming the world while you're still transforming yourself and the order. That's the goal. That's one of the goals in the Kephrian Order. So, and whether you're transforming the order out of something very unselfish or out of selfishness, because you want to see something happen that benefits you, it's still a transformation of the world and the order and yourself. And it's very, very important to us. So in terms of that, that's also part of that integration. Like, how do you do that and work as a CEO or at McDonald's or wherever it is, whatever it is that you're doing? How do you do that transformation? And in terms of that answer, that's individual. Some of it's in the book and some of it's in-person chats with me, and that sort of thing, or other temple leaders and stuff like that. But it will vary. How I do it is different than some of my initiates and some of the other, temple leaders that I know. So we do vary that way. We have a roadmap, but people have different ways of navigating that map, if that makes sense.